All right, 10-minute snack. Everyone knows the rules. Let's eat. All right, so we got Zach Bitter with us here today. Zach, thanks for being here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So we talked a while ago, and I got to know, one, are you still the American world record holder in the 100-mile race, ultramarathon?
Yes, so I've got the American record at the 100 mile and the 12-hour distance, or 12-hour timed event, I guess you'd call it. And then there's like so many different like iterations of that. So those are like outright where it just takes into account like any environment you did it in. And then there's like other ones like
Mm.
off-road or trail and track and things like that. So I also have the world, they call it world best when it's not like a certification from World Athletics. So then I've got a world best on like off-road or trail 100 mile as well.
That's unbelievable. Like, I've looked into some of your numbers, and first of all, 2 second history. I was a cross country runner in high school,
Oh,
and we would
cool.
run 5K. So that's 3 miles to put this into perspective of you doing 100-mile races. And one thing that was very true in cross country was the course you ran played a huge like variable on your time. Like, if you're running a flatter course, you set your PRs, whereas if you're going to the hillier course, it's like you expect to drop a significant like amount of time off your time.
For
Uh,
sure.
so the question that I really want to dive into, it's your area of expertise, and it's a question we get a lot actually, is you're doing these endurance races, like you're taking it to the nth degree, but even for someone that's not doing 100-mile races, uh, there's a concern around low carb, no carb, and I'll say energy utilization and worrying about running out of glycogen reserves, etc. So can you talk a little bit around your strategy of, I know you're low carb, like when do you have carbs? Are you taking them while you're doing a race, before, after? What's kind of your strategy and thought around that?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it sort of depends a little bit on where I am in a training. So the way I like to break it down is I look at kind of the different phases of training, which tend to have a little more similarity within them. If you want to look at it holistically, I'm low carbohydrate basically year round. There's like no point where at the end of the day, when you look at the energy that was metabolized, I would have like a higher amount of carbohydrate energy going out than fat metabolism. Like even on like a race day where I'm not really eating fats and proteins during the race itself, uh, the amount of carbohydrate I am taking in, if you compare that with the amount of body fat I'm going to metabolize to kind of fuel that side of things, it's going to be like, it's going to be much lower. And for some specific numbers on that, I've actually had fat oxidation rates tested at my 100-mile pace, which comes out to be in between like 80-90%, depending on kind of where I am on the speed spectrum of what I'm pacing at that day. So even
Fascinating.
though, yeah, so like really when I look at it from that angle, it's like my goal on race day is I need to defend that like 10 to 20% of my energy that's coming from glycogen, because that's the tank that I could deplete during that day. And even at relatively low intensities, you're out there for 12 hours, you can just kind of slowly trickle away at that. And I do think then like defending that is going to be the goal of from a performance standpoint anyhow, is going to be the goal to do on your fueling of the day. But that just doesn't really take into account the non exogenous fuel that you're burning, which is going to be a huge amount of body fat. For me, that would be 80 to 90% of that day's fuel, or that race's fuel source. So I'm usually looking at it kind of through that lens. And then, there's times that you're like off season where I'm pretty much strict ketogenic. I'm like doing like 5% of my intake from carbohydrate. Then there's like base building where I'm doing a lot of kind of what we consider like below your aerobic threshold or right up to your aerobic threshold, or anything that's kind of in the easy category. And I'm not really crossing over much, or if at all, into what we would consider moderate intensity. And those types of year are a little more consistent because days tend to look a lot more similar, intensities look a lot more similar, and I'm still pretty low carb during that. I'm getting up to like maybe 10% off of that, like off season, 5% during those phases, just to kind of account for some of the extra metabolic activity that's going on when I'm adding that more structured training to it. And then I'll usually be doing some speed work to kind of like prepare that side of the intensity spectrum. And that's usually when my carbs get the highest. So
Mhm.
during that phase of the year, I'm usually around 15 to maybe 20% of my intake from carbohydrate. And the extra kind of deeper dive into that is it's not necessarily every single day is 15 to 20%. That tends to be kind of the average over the course of a week or multiple weeks. I may actually like congest more of my carbohydrate intake for like the week around, say, the 2 or 3 at most sessions that I'm doing at a moderate to high intensity. And then if I have like a rest day or an easy day or recovery day or something like that, then I'm going to be below that number, and it's just going to kind of average out. So that gets to be kind of the more tricky, a little more kind of confusing ones to describe in terms of kind of like what the day would look like. And then since I'm training for 100-mile races, when I peak, I'm just building out my long run, which kind of is almost like a return to the intensity that I would be doing during base training, but just a lot more volume. I might have actually like an extra 50% volume during that phase of training than I would during base. So I'm kind of going back to those numbers. Since it is a little bit extra volume, I'm kind of more like 10-15% is a pretty good number that I'll usually be hitting from a carbohydrate standpoint. And then I'm going to kind of start practicing my race day fueling strategy, which is kind of what I would mention before there, in terms of defending the muscle glycogen at the rates at which I'm going to kind of produce, or the paces I'm going to produce specific rates.
So what I find super fascinating, and this is probably maybe useful for listeners, is you talk about basically we have these two fuel tanks, right? We got the fat fuel tank, which is the big one. We got this glycogen, which is a much smaller fuel tank. And during your 100-mile races, you're 80-90% pulling from that fat fuel tank. So in your speed work, that's when their carbs are a little bit higher. Are you in anaerobic? Because one thing that, maybe listeners need to know, burning fat, we need oxygen for that. So when you're anaerobic, you tend to switch over to like the glycogen. So and that's, I'm guessing, your case for increasing carbohydrate intake during those times. Is that right? And are you pushing the anaerobic end, or just like really hitting aerobic harder and thus for using more from that tank, that glycogen tank?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like the way I like to look at it is like if we look at just even walking up to like all out sprinting where you're going like, purely anaerobic, that's going to be like a spectrum of your ratios that you're going to get tested. So like for me, if I'm walking, I'm probably burning as close to 100% fat
Right.
as I'm going to get. Then I'm all out sprinting, that's like 100% muscle glycogen. So then like I'm sort of using that as like the determiner. So like as I push further, I am doing some like anaerobic substance, like usually like the faster stuff I do tends to be right around my VO2 max. And that's going to be quite a bit glycolytic even when I'm like really low carbohydrate. So then it just becomes kind of like a determining factor of like how much volume of that can I actually tolerate. So I find that when I'm doing like short intervals, I don't have to be quite as diligent with getting my, or I should say like if you look at the ranges I'm hitting during speed work, when I'm doing shorter intervals, I might be closer to the shorter edge of that because I'm only going to be able to do maybe like 30 minutes or so of total volume during the week of that versus say something that's moderate intensity where, now I'm going to be moving off of that like 80-90% fat, 10 to 20% glycogen number into like probably closer to a 50-50 split, if not even if the higher ends of moderate, even like skewed more towards carbohydrate metabolism or glycogen metabolism. But since it's slower than say VO2 max and beyond, I can do more actual volume of it. So like I might be able to put out, like multiple hours worth of that intensity during the week. So I find those tend to actually be the points of training where like I have to be a little more careful about having some more carbohydrate kind of congested around if I want to be able to hit like my targets in terms of volume at that intensity. If that makes sense.
Yep. It makes perfect sense. And super interesting. Curious if like, okay, you're an elite athlete, been ketogenic, burning fat for a long time. If someone is coming, let's just use an outrageous example from the standard American diet and is going to do some like endurance training, do you know, like what's like a rough normal non-ketogenic energy utilization split in that scenario? Like someone from like a standard American diet going out to do like a 5-mile jog, like are they burning fats at different, I'm assuming everyone's different in their ability to use fat versus glycogen, and it changes based on fat adaptability, probably just a whole myriad of factors. But is your 80-90% is it typical or is that atypical?
That's pretty high. If you look at just like the numbers that we would have had like pre-faster study, you're going to see like people who are kind of on the far end of the spectrum from just like, I guess you could maybe call it like trained or natural fat, high fat oxidation rates, we're going to have numbers of like maybe zero 0.9 to maybe 1.0
Mhm.
grams per minute of what their fat oxidation rates are going to peak out at. For me, I'm going to get closer to like 1.6, right around there in terms of my peak fat oxidation rates. So if you look at kind of like the previous ceiling, when you add dietary manipulation for myself and my dietary like habits, I'm basically like 50% higher than that. So there's people even higher than that. I just had a guy on my podcast actually, Matt Kerr, who he worked his fat oxidation rates all the way up to like nearly 1.8. So he's doing like Ironman triathlon, putting like 30 hours of volume. So he's probably got a little lower intensity than I do, which I
Right.
suspect maybe allows him to pull that dietary fat number a little bit higher than I do. Or it could just be genetics too. You see that from time to time. But to answer your question, you're going to have like the way I like to look, like there's multiple levers you can pull to improve fat oxidation rates. Just simply go on in training. If you took someone on a standard American diet and just had them on an endurance training program, their fat oxidation rates would improve. Or you could take someone on a standard American diet, introduce the training, and then also just reposition where their carbohydrate intake is going. So rather than having it kind of like congested in refined amounts around the activity they're doing, have it kind of pushed after in the day, or doing some maybe like fasted longer runs or fasted easy recovery days, and just not necessarily reducing their carbohydrate, but repositioning it, you can see some increase in fat oxidation rates with that. There's some evidence, I don't know that there's a lot of research on it, but there's some evidence that even just like the complexity of the carbohydrate can minimally impact fat oxidation rate. So like straight table sugar versus like maybe a sweet potato or something like that is
Mhm.
gonna, it could improve your fat oxidation rate slightly if you go to the more complex version of that. But then the really big lever, the one that's going to move that needle to like the 50%, or in like Matt's case, 100% improvement in fat oxidation rates, that's going to be a big dietary manipulation, of which you're going to have to reduce your carbohydrate intake. And then that's on the spectrum as well. So like if I'm eating, say, 60 to 70% carbohydrate, decide to drop down to 30 to 35%, that's higher carbohydrate than what I'm doing typically. But it is lower than what they were before. So that dietary shift is going to improve their fat oxidation rates. So it's not necessarily like a black and white thing where like I have to be all fat, no carbs, or all carbs, no fat kind of a thing in
Yeah.
order to get the benefits. The benefits kind of come and go at on a spectrum versus kind of a black and white all or nothing.
I know we're doing a snack here. So many questions just coming to mind. One that I gotta hurry up and get through is uh do you think this is like one of your competitive advantages? Like you have these really high fat oxidation rates, you're doing these 100-mile runs, that you have this fuel tank that you're able to more efficiently tap into than other competitors that are not basically ketogenic.
Yeah, it gets a little messy when you kind of compare person to person, because it sort of becomes apples to orange, because you have some folks like I have competitors and friends in the sport who are moderate high carbohydrate, and they can just mainline like 400 or 500 calories an hour and do not get digestive issues. Whereas
Ah,
if I did that, I would be like wasting time like with digestive issues and things like that. So I think it gives me an advantage against my moderate high carb self. So like it's going to drive that. But for a person who is like able to tolerate the consumption of high amounts of carbohydrate during the event itself, it's maybe less of a benefit for them because they're
mhm,
still defending muscle glycogen. That's
right.
why I like the muscle glycogen kind of way of looking at it, because it kind of puts everyone in the same spot where it's like I might be able to defend muscle glycogen on, say, like 30 grams of carbohydrate per hour, whereas if I were moderate to high carb, I'd probably need closer to 50 to 70 grams. So like if I could do 50 to 70 grams, I don't know that I'd have a big performance advantage uh comparatively to myself. If there's a lot that we just don't know yet in terms of like research on like low carbohydrate endurance and how that impacts potential like recovery and other things like that. There's a lot of anecdotes. But that's kind of ultra running in general. There's just not a lot of research to be had. So I like to look at it as like there's a pretty big window of different kind of eating patterns you can probably successfully do for ultra running. And then it comes down to like what does the individual need? So when I'm working with people, we try to look at that through like, well, what can you actually tolerate from an eating standpoint? And a good chunk of the coaching clients I have, struggle or don't want to be able to do what they would need to do to be able to tolerate that 50 to 70 grams per hour, because there is likely a need to practice that. So like if I wanted to be able to tolerate 50 to 70 grams of carbohydrate per hour, I'm probably eating a lot of carbohydrate sources during my workouts, like refined like sports products and things. And the average person isn't training like I am, where they're putting in 20 hours of training per week and can have this massive like energy output that needs to be met. Most people are trying to also think about health and also as an activity to kind of supplement their life and kind of double dip, have fun, also improve health through running. They're not looking through that window of like, oh, I have like this endless limit of essentially energy I can take in. And it might not be in their best interest from a health standpoint to having to be like taking gels and sports drinks and things like that on a daily basis in order to kind of train their body to be able to tolerate that. So then it also kind of becomes like a professional versus like someone who's just a participant or someone who's enjoying the activity, but also has a lot of other life obligations that are either more important or as important as how they finish on that race course.
Yep, makes total sense. So two last things real fast. One is, do you have go-to carb sources like that work best for you?
Yeah, like on event day, I usually it gets kind of interesting because you have I like to do some like liquid products that are kind of easy and a little faster acting, and then I like solid food options. So for me, I'll use this product called S Fuels Race Plus. It's got like small amounts of fat and protein in it just to kind of help ease the digestion a little bit. But it's mostly going to be carbohydrate there. So I'll do that for about usually around half of my intake. And then I'll be doing something that's a little more solid that I'll try to kind of pair with it. That's a little more crunchy, salty, a little more savory. And it can be something as simple as like potato dipped in salt, like a cracker, sourdough bread, something like that.
Cool, cool. And then last thing is, I'm obviously a lot of people listening to this doing meat-based diets or thinking about it. I'm sure people you've worked with, like the transition, right? So, so you go for Center American diet, you start eating mostly only meat. I personally experienced adaptation time period. Do you see that? How long can people to wrap their head around before like, hey, I'm eating low carb ketogenic. When can I start running 100-mile marathons with Zach? Like,
Yeah.
what's the
Yeah, I think there's I don't know that you have to like necessarily wait. There might be just like a little bit of a time lapse in terms of just being able to kind of figure out like where you best fit with those ranges. Because like those percentages I listed, those tend to work well for the majority of the folks I'm working with that are low carb and work for myself. But there are people who fall outside those that are either like a much more strict ketogenic, or I've got some clients who are, mostly carnivore, depending on how you want to define it. Like they're eating like 90+% animal products. And the transition is essentially just kind of figuring out kind of where to place that stuff so that your workouts are going to be as high quality as we can expect given your lifestyle and things like that. In terms of like how quickly your fat oxidation rates go up, those go up pretty quickly. Like those don't take like months or years to establish. So usually I think the time investment is more of just like giving yourself enough time to like figure out if it's going to work for you or not, and then having that flexibility with time to make adjustments to see what's going to work better than something else at your own personal level. For me, it took me probably about a year and a half to really fine tune kind of like the percentages of carbohydrate and fats and proteins to where I wanted them. But in terms of my body kind of like flipping the switch and burning high levels of fat, that probably happened within weeks.
Yeah. Well, what I think is interesting, just a final thing I'm thinking about when you're saying that, is people that have high degrees of insulin resistance or hyperinsulinemia. So they have these chronically high levels of insulin, which may make it harder for them to tap their fat stores. And so like they're carb dependent. So I was curious, like, someone in that situation, you just drop the carbs and you start doing endurance running. That's a good way to probably, overcome that hyperinsulinemia like decently as fast as possible, really, because if you don't, like, you need to tap into that energy storage.
Yeah, and I think really like when if someone's worried about the transition, and I can appreciate that. I mean, when I switched, I mean, I've been doing this since the end of 2011 now, so I've had like quite a bit of repetition in that time. But when I started, I had like a 4-week off season where I just went pretty strict keto and was not really worried about training quality or training structure or anything. So like in the best of worlds, when someone is switching, I think like, waiting till you're finished with whatever kind of key event you were doing, if you can, or like giving yourself a little bit of a, maybe like a 4-week ramp up where you're more invested in the nutritional side of things than you are the training side of things, and let everything kind of like, figure out where it fits and stuff like that. So, yeah, there is, it gets interesting, I think, when you're looking at the different people and the way they respond.
Yep. Awesome. That makes total sense. Thank you for being here with the snack. Sorry, I went long. I had too many questions. I know people can find you at zachbitter.com, right? Anywhere else?
Yeah, zachbitter.com has links to everything else, like social media, Instagram, Twitter, my podcast, and all that stuff. So if you head there, you can kind of figure out what I'm up to.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Zach.
Thanks a bunch, Kevin.
Snack time's over. Did you enjoy the snack? If so, drop me a comment. Let me know if we should dive deeper and do a full meal on this topic. Also, P.S. if you liked the snacks, you're going to love our bites. A daily email bite, a golden nugget, better than a pasture-raised egg yolk. All right, maybe not that good, but it is a daily bite to optimize your health and nutrition with a meat-based diet. Access right now is totally free. Link below. See you in the bites.